Hey guys, I am Ariana da Silva. I'm from Brazil, Amazon region. I would like to Bioanth talks about colonialism, genetic ancestry, sickle cell disease, and health implications in the Amazon. The map shows some indigenous populations that lived in Brazil during the Portuguese colonization, with a lot of populations like Tucano, Caribe, Tupinambá, Tupi-Guarani, Gê, Aruaque, and others. In Brazil, colonialism and its consequences have many phases associated with historical factors, such as more than 3 centuries of slavery with great social disparities. The map shows the Brazilian division during the colonization. The slave trades between 18th and 19th century during the Portuguese colonizations enslaved 5 million African people to Brazil. In the same period, Africans in condition of slavery brought to the Amazon from Mulembo, Cabinda, Luanda, Benguela, to Belém, São Luís, Recife, Salvador, Rio de Janeiro. The map shows the number of newborns with sickle cell anemia in each country in 2015. And we can see that in Brazil, the prevalence is high. The social consequence of the colonialism in Brazil is because Brazil is the largest country in Latin America with higher mixed population, originated from the encounter of European, Native Americans, and African, and which gave origin to a hierarchical society shaped under the false premise of racial democracy, yet extremely racist. The biological consequence of colonialism in Brazil is the hemoglobin. Sickle cell disease risk is a high risk in our country. Our objectives are investigated the biological and cultural categories between the patients diagnosed with sickle cell disease and understand the intersection between the social identity versus genomic ancestry, and analyze the clinical symptoms of the participants with sickle cell disease as opposed to their biosocial condition. The epidemiology of sickle cell disease around the world is that sickle cell disease is the most common genetic disease in the world. In Brazil, the inheritance of sickle cell disease is one important problem of the health Black people. The epidemiology of sickle cell disease in Brazil in the state of Pará, Amazon, around 3,500 children are born with sickle cell disease per year in Brazil. In the state of Pará, 1% of the population is affected by sickle cell. In our sample, 9% self-declared Black, but around 8% have mostly European DNA. The map shows some cities that participated that study in the state of Pará, Amazonia. And we are here. In our methodology, we analyzed 6 people with sickle cell disease in the state of Pará. We collected blood samples in the regional blood center, and we did genetic ancestry tests, ethnographic research, and we used the SAS assist version at University of South Florida to analyze a lot of data. We have in Brazil the structural racism with variation in skin color, racism and institutional racism, and difficult to access to health service, like the diagnosis of the food test in Brazil, because in our state, Pará, the universalizations of food tests started in 2010, so it's absolutely a problem because we have a lot of case that we don't know. Some results shows that the group presents DNA with European predominance, followed by Amerindian and African DNA. But 83% of the participants self-classified as brown or black, 75% live in the poverty, 72% indicate that they have suffered some form of institutional racism and racism due to sickle cell disease or else because of their skin color. In a lot of places, like in their own family, at school, in some health service, like in the urgence and emergency health service, at work, and the group have difficulty to have a job vacancy. In this table, we can see the people with sickle cell disease about the income, and the majority live in the poverty with until one minimum wage per month. This table shows self-declared color, race, and DNA in sample with people with sickle cell disease. And the numbers of the DNA European with 58.2% with European DNA, 21.8% with Amerindian DNA, and 20% with African DNA. It's our figure about the genomic ancestry of people with sickle cell disease in the Amazon region with the most European DNA. In our results, we have 50% the people have private health insurance, and it limits access to essential medical care of the population. The symptoms don't have difference between women and men, but 18% between sex or age category with 2.34 more severe symptoms among women, and genetic ancestry of the DNA is not differently correlated with the severity of the clinical symptoms, but the people with the great European ancestry demonstrate the high number of the symptoms. The table shows the recurrent clinical manifestations of sickle cell disease in our states, like jaundice, occlusive pain, fever, infections, abdominal pain, leg ulcer, stroke, and the others. People with African DNA had lower number and lower severity of clinical symptoms. And it's important to understand that evolutionary data, sickle cell disease is associated with probably African origin, prevalent disease among the Black and brown population. And the higher income for all groups have the smaller the number of symptoms. The number of symptoms has a relation inversely proportional to the total value of the income. We found important association between race, color, self-declaration, and specific clinical symptoms of sickle cell disease. For example, 100% incidence for abdominal pain among self-defined yellow individuals, 57.69% incidence for infection among self-identified Black individuals, and 50% incidence for stroke among self-classified whites. Like we can see, we did DNA results of people with sickle cell disease in the state of Pará too. For example, he has European DNA and declares himself brown. She has European DNA and self-declares herself brown. She has European DNA and self-declares herself like white. She has indigenous DNA and self-declares herself like brown. He has European DNA and self-declares himself like Black. She has African DNA and self-declares herself like Black. She has European DNA and self-declares herself like brown. It's our DNA results. In our conclusions, it's important to understand that anthropological research is necessary to help help understand the extent of persistent colonialism among the Brazilian populations. In our sample, the clinical manifestations of sickle cell disease can be measured according to the data of genomic ancestry and self-declaration, race, color, when dealing with subtle differences that involve DNA, gender, sex, age, and income. But only socioeconomic status of the genetic ancestry cannot answer the complexity of the sickle cell disease symptoms. The specific clinical symptoms like abdominal pain, infection, and stroke should be taken to the analysis of polymorphism associated with these events in order to understand with SNPs points to this prevalence and how the phenotype can influence the genotype and vice versa, according to the social environment condition involved too. Questions? Our reference. Thank you so much.